The enemy blade pierced my chest during the final autumn charge, terminating my previous existence. I expected the cold underworld, but woke up inside a blindingly bright white metallic room instead. A deafening mechanical hum replaced the familiar sounds of dying horses and screaming warriors. I attempted to stand, but my biological energy reserves registered at exactly 0% capacity. 3 strange figures stood over my transparent bed, wearing identical green synthetic garments. Their relaxed posture displayed a complete lack of martial discipline or foundational combat training. An older man with silver hair observed me with cold calculation while a younger warrior smirked openly. A woman stood slightly behind them, holding a glowing flat slate securely in her bare hands. I analyzed my immediate operational resources, revealing a catastrophic deficit. My heavy armor was gone, and my dual swords were missing, leaving me completely defenseless in an unknown territory. The silver-haired man pointed at my chest while speaking rapidly to the female observer. I noticed a small patch on his shoulder depicting an eagle, which clearly indicated his high command rank. A mechanical voice echoed from the ceiling, announcing that Subject Alpha had regained consciousness. I did not understand the guttural words, but the sudden tonal shift initiated their testing phase. 2 heavy guards grabbed my bare arms and dragged me toward a cold metallic table. I calculated the precise geometric angle required to break their grips, but my muscles lacked the necessary fuel. They strapped my wrists down, utilizing synthetic restraints that offered 0 breaking points. Panic consumes valuable calories, so I regulated my breathing to preserve oxygen and observed their tools. The young warrior named Miller leaned close to my face and barked a harsh command. His eyes held the specific arrogance of a man who relied entirely on superior equipment rather than personal skill. A metal needle pierced my skin, delivering a cold, foreign liquid directly into my depleted veins. My body immediately rejected the synthetic substance, causing violent muscle spasms across my torso. Miller laughed out loud at my biological reaction, viewing my physical weakness as entertainment. A strategist records every insult but postpones the required retaliation until profit is guaranteed. They released the restraints and threw a gray garment onto my chest. The thin fabric lacked any defensive properties whatsoever, forcing me to dress slowly while analyzing the room for exit routes. A heavy metal door slid open without a sound, revealing a long corridor lit by artificial suns. The woman gestured for me to follow her while the 2 armed guards maintained a strict rear overwatch. We entered a large hall filled with strange metal boxes and glowing glass panels. I rapidly counted 40 hostile soldiers occupying the room, but none of them carried visible melee combat weapons. They presented a plastic tray covered in a soft brown paste and brightly colored liquids. I sniffed the substance and immediately detected a heavy chemical odor completely unnatural to real food. The silver-haired commander watched me closely, waiting for my biological reaction. I pushed the tray away because consuming unknown chemical rations in enemy territory drops survival rates to 0. Miller slammed his fist onto the table and yelled a very clear insult. He grabbed a metal spoon and aggressively shoved it toward my face, intending to force the strange paste into my open mouth. I intercepted his wrist and applied precise pressure directly to his radial nerve. Even with my completely depleted energy reserves, his grip instantly failed, dropping the spoon onto the hard floor. The surrounding guards raised their black iron sticks and pointed them straight at my chest. I released his arm, immediately recognizing that those black tubes were highly lethal projectile weapons. The woman raised her hands and spoke soft words to calm the aggressive soldiers. She looked at me with a strange mixture of curiosity and pity, which I found completely unacceptable for a warrior. They escorted me outside to a massive concrete arena surrounded by high walls. The air smelled of burnt sulfur, while deafening explosions constantly echoed from the far western end of the compound. Miller shoved a heavy black metal object into my hands and pointed toward a paper target 100 paces away. I examined the weapon, noting its awkward weight distribution and freezing cold grip. I searched the mechanism for a match cord or a flint spark generator, but found nothing familiar. There was absolutely 0 gunpowder pouch and no ramrod to load the projectile into the long barrel. The young officer yelled another command and pointed aggressively at the paper target. I held the unfamiliar weapon like a standard wooden spear, causing the entire group of soldiers to laugh loudly. Miller snatched the weapon back and rapidly manipulated several small levers on the side. He aimed at the distant target and produced 3 deafening thunderclaps that shredded the paper instantly. He shoved the weapon back into my chest and mocked my obvious tactical incompetence. My mind raced as I calculated the terrifying destructive efficiency of their tools compared to my ancient sword. I stood completely isolated in the center of the training ground, holding the metal tube. Every single soldier viewed me as a primitive savage representing a totally failed military science project. The silver-haired commander shook his head and turned his back in utter disappointment. He spoke into a small black box attached to his chest, indicating that my immediate disposal was highly likely. I realized that brute physical force would result in my execution within 10 seconds. My only remaining operational weapon was the strategic intellect that had conquered 3 provinces in my past. I dropped their iron weapon onto the dirt to eliminate their perception of an active physical threat. I then folded my legs and sank into a perfect lotus meditation stance right in the open arena. The mocking laughter slowly died down as the soldiers stared at my sudden display of absolute calm. Miller stepped forward to kick dirt onto my face, but I refused to blink or alter my steady breath. A commander who fears public humiliation has already lost the battle before the first strike. I closed my eyes and completely ignored the hostile environment to rebuild my internal psychological focus. The woman slowly approached my position and crouched down to closely observe my face. I could hear the rapid beating of her heart, which indicated high stress mixed with intense academic fascination. She spoke a few soft words into her glowing slate, and a mechanical voice translated the phrase. The machine utilized heavily broken Japanese, asking me to identify my clan and my primary military rank. I opened my eyes and looked directly into her soul to establish a foundation of dominance. I spoke my true name, clearly knowing she represented my only viable bridge to surviving this new nightmare. The machine translated my words back to her, and her eyes widened in absolute shock. She stood up rapidly and ran toward the silver-haired commander, waving her glowing slate in the air frantically. I calculated that I had successfully created a minimum viable resource of intellectual intrigue. The female historian would now actively protect me from termination to study my immense tactical value. The commander stopped walking away and turned back to carefully observe my meditating form. I remained perfectly still, letting them falsely believe they held absolute control over my physical state. Miller spat on the ground and muttered a harsh curse before marching away from the shooting range. He had won the physical confrontation but completely failed to shatter my psychological foundation. They relocated me to a secure observation room featuring a large transparent glass wall. Dr. Weaver entered carrying her glowing translation slate and placed a physical paper map on the metal table. I currently possessed 0 direct military authority and 0 combat capability in this strange new era. My only tradable asset was my tactical intellect, which needed immediate monetization to secure basic resources. Weaver pushed a ceramic bowl across the heavy metal table containing plain boiled rice and steamed fish. She understood my digestive system completely rejected their chemical rations and offered a valuable compromise. Consuming the natural food restored my physical energy levels by approximately 12%. I acknowledged this critical transaction with a slight nod, knowing I now owed her an equivalent in tactical data. She tapped her slate and the blank wall suddenly transformed into a massive moving digital image. I suppressed my natural instinct to draw a sword and analyze the chaotic battlefield displayed in the moving pictures. Modern soldiers wearing extremely heavy armor moved slowly through a ruined urban environment. Invisible enemy forces fired upon them from all directions, creating a massive tactical disadvantage for the armored troops. The invisible enemy forces were officially labeled as phantoms by the mechanical translation device. They utilized explosive traps and rapid repositioning to completely neutralize the superior firepower of the modern army. Weaver carefully explained that their advanced analytical artificial intelligence could not predict the phantom movements. The machine calculated an 89% randomness factor in all recent enemy tactical engagements. Colonel Richards and Lieutenant Miller stood just behind the transparent glass wall observing our interaction. Miller openly displayed a smirk of absolute superiority, confident that a primitive warrior could never understand this war. I completely ignored the arrogant lieutenant and focused entirely on the topographical data displayed on the physical map. The artificial intelligence analyzed technology and weapon trajectories, but it completely ignored raw human fear. I demanded Weaver replay the last 5 engagement records back-to-back with no audio. I needed to establish a solid behavioral baseline for the Phantom commanders to locate the strategic anchor behind their strikes. Each digital battle showed the Phantoms attacking heavily fortified supply convoys and retreating before modern air support arrived. They never fought a sustained engagement, which indicated a severe limitation in total manpower. They were fighting a prolonged war of attrition against an enemy with functionally infinite resources. A standard commander would attack the weakest points, but these Phantoms deliberately targeted heavily defended psychological centers. I placed my index finger on the paper map connecting 3 recent engagement zones. The resulting geometric pattern formed a perfect strategic wedge designed to slowly herd the modern forces toward a specific mountainous region. Weaver translated my physical gestures into verbal reports for the observing officers through the internal microphone. I explained that the enemy was not retreating in panic but conducting a controlled retrograde operation. The communication device relayed a loud laugh from Lieutenant Miller into our observation room. He stated that a savage from the 18th century had zero understanding of modern mechanized logistics and satellite surveillance grids. I calculated the total cost of ignoring his juvenile insult at exactly 0 resources lost. Responding to emotional provocations from inferior tacticians only drains valuable mental energy required for accurate strategic calculations. I tapped the topographical map exactly 30 kilometers north of the last known engagement zone. This specific location featured a narrow gorge with extremely limited visibility, which perfectly neutralized overhead satellite observation. The Phantom forces had spent 4 full weeks conditioning the modern army to expect attacks on the open desert plains. This psychological conditioning creates a false sense of security when entering seemingly quiet mountain territories. I instructed Weaver to input my complete analysis directly into their artificial intelligence system. I established a 95% mathematical probability of a major ambush at the gorge within the next 48 operational hours. If my prediction proved correct, I demanded an immediate elevation in my security clearance. I required access to their tactical communication network to upgrade my authority level from 0 to level 1. Richard stepped up to the glass and pressed the communication button on his console. He accepted the transaction with a cold tone, stating that a failed prediction would result in my immediate transfer to a medical laboratory. The stakes were absolute physical survival versus permanent biological dissection. I closed my eyes and entered a deep meditative state to conserve my biological resources while the digital countdown clock on the wall began ticking. 30 long hours passed with absolutely 0 hostile activity reported across the entire southern sector. Miller walked past the glass several times, pointing at his wrist device to maximize the psychological pressure on my mind. Weaver brought me a second bowl of plain rice and visually displayed high levels of professional anxiety. She had invested her entire reputation into my tactical abilities, and a failure here would terminate her military career. I consumed the ration, slowly chewing each individual grain to maximize caloric absorption. Panic accelerates heart rates and consumes energy, so I maintained a steady pulse of 60 beats per minute to optimize efficiency. At hour 41, the main facility alarm sirens began screaming through the sterile corridors. Red lights flashed across the observation room while the large digital map on the wall suddenly filled with hostile markers. Weaver dropped her glowing slate as the tactical communication channels erupted in absolute chaos. A heavily armored logistics convoy had just entered the exact gorge I had designated on the physical paper map yesterday. The Phantoms triggered multiple massive rock slides to trap the convoy vehicles inside the narrow pass. The artificial intelligence system immediately calculated a 70% probability of total destruction within 3 minutes. I opened my eyes and looked directly through the glass at Lieutenant Miller. His previous arrogant smirk had completely vanished, replaced by pale skin and wide eyes staring at the catastrophic data on his primary screen. My ancient prediction was absolutely correct, proving that human psychology remains identical across centuries. Technology simply changes the speed of death, but the underlying principles of deception and fear never truly change. Colonel Richards slammed his fist onto his primary console and ordered immediate aerial support to the location. The communication officer reported that a massive unnatural storm over the gorge blocked all aerial targeting and satellite views. The Phantom forces had calculated the local weather patterns to perfectly synchronize with their massive ambush. It was a classic terrain trap executed with absolute precision that left the modern technological army completely blind and helpless. I turned to Weaver and reminded her of the agreed transaction parameters. I had delivered a perfectly accurate strategic prediction, and now the military command owed me the specified level 1 security clearance for future operations. Richard stared at me through the glass with a mixture of deep suspicion and newfound tactical respect. He authorized the system override, and my digital profile instantly updated from primitive test subject to tactical asset. I had successfully established my first operational economy, exchanging historical warfare patterns for modern digital authority. My command resource pool was no longer empty, providing a solid foundation for my future expansion and survival. The live audio feed from the trapped gorge broadcasted the desperate screams of modern soldiers under heavy fire. They possessed superior rifles and armored vehicles but lacked any defensive strategy against the falling rocks and mortars. Miller frantically barked orders into his communication device, attempting to coordinate a tactical retreat to the south. I analyzed his commands and quickly calculated that his proposed withdrawal route would lead directly into a second enemy trap. I snatched the glowing slate from Weaver and rapidly drew a harsh red line across the digital topography on her screen. I indicated a steep eastern ridge that appeared impassable to vehicles but offered solid cover for a small infantry force. Weaver hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before transmitting my unauthorized tactical overlay to the main command console. The tactical map updated instantly, overriding Miller's calculated retreat path with my primitive strategic alternative. Miller exploded in pure anger, demanding that Richards arrest me for interfering with an active combat operation. He argued that the steep eastern ridge was a fatal choke point and my strategy would kill the remaining survivors. Richards analyzed the artificial intelligence projection for my proposed route. The machine estimated a 50% casualty rate if the soldiers abandoned their vehicles to climb the steep eastern ridge. This was still better than total annihilation. He countermanded Miller's order and transmitted my strategic overlay directly to the commander in the gorge. He offered the trapped soldiers a choice between 2 fatal options, allowing the man on the ground to make the final decision. The commander analyzed the terrain and the enemy fire patterns with his own eyes. He ignored the artificial intelligence projection and ordered his men to abandon the vehicles and climb the eastern ridge immediately. The soldiers scrambled up the steep rocky incline while the Phantom forces concentrated heavy fire on their exposed positions. The modern troops utilized their heavy armor to absorb the incoming projectiles while they continued to climb. They suffered exactly 2 casualties during the chaotic climb, representing a 7% loss. The artificial intelligence had miscalculated the defensive value of their armor against indirect fire from a high angle. The machine focused on ballistic penetration but ignored the psychological effect of heavy suppressive fire. It failed to account for the fact that a scared soldier rarely aims his weapon with perfect mathematical precision. I had now twice demonstrated the severe limitations of their absolute reliance on digital battlefield calculations. A machine can predict the trajectory of a bullet, but it cannot predict the trembling hand of the man who fires it. The surviving 28 soldiers reached the top of the eastern ridge completely exhausted but alive. They had successfully escaped the primary kill zone, but were now isolated deep within hostile enemy territory without any vehicles. The artificial intelligence instantly recalculated their survival probability at exactly 9%. They possessed limited ammunition and 0 heavy weapons to defend against the inevitable Phantom pursuit units that would hunt them down. Richards ordered an immediate aerial extraction, but the heavy storm still blocked all air traffic. He turned to me and demanded a long-range extraction plan that did not require any aerial support to execute successfully. I analyzed the topographical map and identified a narrow river running through a deep canyon 5 miles east. The Phantom forces possessed 0 naval assets, making the river an impenetrable barrier to their ground pursuit units. The Allied soldiers needed to reach that river within exactly 3 hours to survive. The Phantom pursuit units would arrive in approximately 2 hours, giving me a very narrow window to execute my next phase of the plan. I ordered the artillery battery to fire a single smoke shell directly into the center of the abandoned convoy wreckage. Miller screamed that revealing our artillery position for a single smoke shell was a catastrophic tactical error. I ignored his outburst. The smoke provided 0 tactical value, but it created a massive psychological signal for the enemy. It told them we were still actively trying to salvage the expensive armored vehicles they had destroyed. The Phantom commander on the ground immediately redirected his forces to secure the wreckage. He assumed the smokescreen was cover for a team of our combat engineers attempting to recover the valuable technology. He left only a small contingent of 30 operatives to pursue our fleeing soldiers into the eastern hills. The mathematical odds had now shifted from 30 against 100 to 28 against 30, which was a significant improvement. I then ordered the Allied artillery to begin a systematic bombardment of the entire eastern mountain range. The shells were not aimed at the enemy, but at the surrounding peaks to create a massive auditory and seismic distraction. The constant explosions completely masked the sound of our soldiers moving through the terrain. The Phantom pursuit units were now effectively blind and deaf, unable to track their prey using conventional stealth tactics. I instructed the Delta Squad commander to utilize the loud explosions as cover to move rapidly toward the eastern river. The soldiers ran at maximum speed, completely ignoring standard stealth protocols because the auditory chaos made them completely obsolete. The artificial intelligence instantly recalculated the survival probability based on the new topographical advantage. The fatal red warning vanished, replaced by a solid green 60% survival metric. Miller stared at the updated numerical projection with his mouth slightly open. His perfect technological algorithm had completely failed to account for basic human logistical limitations in a high-stress combat environment. I had spent 0 physical energy and utilized 0 weapon systems during this entire exchange. My only investment was the application of ancient historical logic to a modern battlefield map, yielding massive operational profit. Richards wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead and keyed his communication microphone. He ordered the trapped infantry to maintain their highly elevated defensive perimeter and await a secondary extraction sequence. The convoy vehicles were completely destroyed, representing a severe material loss for the military. However, preserving 28 trained soldiers out of 30 constituted a major tactical victory under ambush conditions. I had successfully demonstrated my core utility to the command structure. A primitive savage could not calculate enemy ammunition reserves purely by analyzing audio patterns and fundamental psychological combat restrictions. Weaver documented the entire exchange on her glowing slate with rapidly moving fingers. She was officially recording the first successful application of my historical tactical framework against the phantom terrorist network. I turned away from the transparent glass wall and returned to my metal chair. I folded my hands and closed my eyes deliberately, ignoring the high-ranking officers to establish a psychological boundary regarding my autonomy. Richards and Miller conversed in low tones, completely outside my designated observation room. They were currently debating the massive strategic implications of utilizing a temporal anomaly to command their modern forces. I understood that my initial operational, the artificial intelligence, finalized the Gorge combat report projecting a total loss of the northern supply route. My previous prediction was perfectly accurate but yielded completely insufficient authority. Predicting a single ambush only proves basic observational competence without demonstrating actual command capability. The military high command still viewed me as a mere historical curiosity rather than a weapon. Colonel Richards entered the observation room holding a physical printed document. He announced that the Pentagon demanded immediate termination of the Ancestor Echo project due to a severe lack of reliable data. I calculated my current survival trajectory at exactly 0% if the experimental project closed. They would inevitably return my body to a cryogenic stasis chamber or dissect my brain for physical study. Richards stated I possessed exactly one final opportunity to prove my strategic value to the global military command. He ordered my immediate transfer to the primary tactical simulator matrix located underground. Lieutenant Miller stepped forward, displaying a highly visible expression of arrogant victory. He had personally designed the digital simulation parameters specifically to ensure my complete and humiliating failure. Miller designated the upcoming combat scenario as Cobra Gorge, establishing strictly fixed mathematical parameters. I would command 100 infantrymen defending a static convoy against 1,000 operatives. The simulated enemy forces possessed superior mechanical mobility and heavy explosive capabilities. My designated forces possessed only basic rifles and absolutely zero aerial support or mechanized reinforcements. The Central Artificial Intelligence calculated my baseline probability of victory at exactly 2%. I accepted this extreme tactical deficit without displaying any emotional reaction to the observing officers. Complaining about unfair numbers is a characteristic trait of fundamentally inferior commanders. A true tactical strategist simply treats the numerical disadvantage as a hard variable to manipulate and overcome. 2 armed guards escorted me to a massive circular room filled with glowing blue screens and complex digital interfaces. I immediately identified my primary operational weakness within this specific environment. I could not physically operate their advanced digital machines due to my complete lack of technological education. A commander who cannot rapidly transmit orders to his troops is effectively a dead commander. I required a perfectly loyal proxy to interface directly with the digital military network. I systematically evaluated the available personnel in the room and focused my attention entirely on Dr. Weaver. Weaver possessed high analytical intelligence but completely lacked formal military rank or operational authority. Her current professional status was categorized merely as a civilian historical academic consultant. I needed to elevate her organizational position to serve as my exclusive primary command conduit. I approached the central holographic projection table and pointed my finger directly at the main control terminal. I spoke clearly in my native tongue, demanding that Weaver receive full administrative override access to the simulation input controls. I established this requirement as a non-negotiable operational foundation. Miller immediately objected to my demand, citing strict military security protocols and operational hierarchy. He aggressively argued that a civilian historian could never operate command-level tactical interfaces. The lieutenant wanted to forcefully assign his designated technicians to input my strategic commands. Accepting his technicians would place unverified enemy loyalists directly within my fragile command structure. Those hostile technicians would intentionally delay my combat orders by critical fractions of a second. In a high-speed digital engagement, those tiny communication delays would mathematically guarantee my defeat. I crossed my arms and deliberately refused to look at the glowing holographic display. I established a hard boundary offering absolutely zero compliance until Weaver received full unrestricted access to the terminal. Richards rapidly calculated the political cost of the resulting delay. The high-ranking Pentagon observers were already actively watching the live video feed from their remote command centers across the country. He decisively bypassed the objections of his junior officer and officially authorized Weaver to take the primary seat at the simulation control desk. He granted her temporary Level 4 tactical clearance instantly. This administrative victory represented my first successful acquisition of human capital in this era. I had effectively converted Weaver from a passive translator into a highly active and integrated subordinate. Her entire professional fate was now permanently tethered to my strategic success or failure. Weaver sat at the heavy metal console and nervously initiated the primary digital interface using her new credentials. Her hands trembled slightly over the illuminated keys, indicating a very high level of psychological stress. She fully understood that failing this specific simulation would terminate her academic career completely. I needed to test her compliance under pressure before the actual combat phase commenced. I instructed her to delete the standard operational doctrine files loaded into our virtual infantry units immediately. Weaver hesitated and stared at the bright red warning notifications flashing across her primary screen. Deleting doctrine files would force the virtual soldiers to rely entirely on manual inputs without automation. Relying exclusively on manual inputs traditionally results in severe response delays and massive casualty rates. I maintained intense eye contact and repeated the deletion order utilizing a completely flat tone. A subordinate who openly questions unconventional orders during the preparation phase will inevitably panic during actual combat. I required absolute and blind obedience to function properly in this modern environment. She swallowed hard and pressed the execution button, confirming the total deletion of the standard tactical algorithms. The Central Artificial Intelligence immediately issued a loud verbal warning regarding the action. Miller laughed loudly, echoing through the command center, calling the unauthorized maneuver a guaranteed digital suicide pact. He eagerly anticipated watching my unprogrammed virtual troops stand paralyzed under fire. The psychological compliance test was absolutely successful. Weaver had prioritized my ancient logic over her modern military programming. I now possessed a fully functional and obedient command interface capable of executing highly unorthodox tactical maneuvers. The main holographic projector immediately illuminated the digital terrain map. It displayed a deep, rocky canyon with a single narrow road running through the exact center. Our convoy was trapped precisely in the middle of the low ground. Miller began aggressively reading the weapon specifications for our virtual units into the room microphone. He loudly listed firing rates, projectile velocities, and thermal optic ranges for all to hear. He expected me to construct a defense based on maximum damage output. I completely ignored his useless numerical data. Relying on weapon specifications against a numerically superior enemy is a mathematically flawed strategy. 10 rifles will always lose to 100 rifles in a static exchange. I turned to Weaver and issued my first strategic data request. I demanded the exact soil composition of the Eastern Canyon slope. I specifically needed the current clay to sand ratio and the underlying foundational rock type. The entire command room went completely silent. The technicians stared at me in absolute confusion. Miller broke the silence by mocking my primitive focus on dirt instead of advanced ballistic capabilities. Weaver rapidly typed my request into the digital terminal. The artificial intelligence rejected the query, stating that geological composition was completely irrelevant to standard infantry combat algorithms. The system denied her access. I did not alter my demand. I instructed Weaver to bypass the combat algorithm and pull the raw geographical survey data directly from the satellite archives. Without knowing the exact stability of the Earth, I could not weaponize the environment. Miller stepped forward and ordered Weaver to stop wasting precious time. He stated the simulation clock was running, and our virtual troops were already taking simulated mortar fire from the phantom forces on the ridge. I blocked his path to the terminal using my physical presence to establish a defensive perimeter around my subordinate. I calmly reiterated that atmospheric and geological data was significantly superior to ballistic data. Richards observed the confrontation without intervening. He was testing my ability to maintain command authority under severe internal pressure. Conceding to Miller now would instantly destroy my operational credibility. Weaver executed a manual override of the artificial intelligence system. She accessed the global satellite database and extracted the raw geological scans of the target canyon. She displayed the raw numbers on her screen. The eastern slope consisted of exactly 42% loose clay resting on a smooth shale foundation. This specific geological composition meant the Earth was highly unstable and prone to massive structural failure. I acquired my first critical tactical advantage. I then issued my second data request. I demanded the precise barometric pressure readings and the local humidity percentages for the simulated combat zone. Miller threw his hands up in frustration. He loudly declared to the observation room that I was trying to predict the weather while my virtual soldiers were being actively slaughtered by explosive munitions. I ignored the distraction and processed the numbers Weaver provided. The humidity was 94% and the barometric pressure was dropping rapidly. This indicated a severe localized precipitation event was imminent. My third data request focused entirely on psychology. I asked for the base morale integer of the Phantom operative units when operating in heavy rain without direct visual contact with their primary commanders. The technicians audibly groaned at my strange request. The system artificial intelligence flashed red text indicating that enemy morale calculations were highly speculative and not recommended for foundational tactical planning. Weaver did not hesitate this time. She had fully committed to my strategic process. She forced the system to generate the psychological profile based on past Phantom engagements in similar atmospheric conditions. The machine outputted a specific variable. Phantom operatives experienced a 20% reduction in combat cohesion when visual communication lines were severed by environmental factors like heavy smoke or fog. I now possessed all three required variables. Unstable clay foundation. Imminent heavy rain. A psychological weakness to visual isolation. I began calculating the precise intersection of these three distinct elements. Our virtual forces had already suffered 12% casualties from the initial enemy bombardment. The artificial intelligence updated the probability of victory from 2% down to less than 1%. Miller ordered Weaver to initiate a standard defensive perimeter utilizing the armored vehicles as cover. That was the textbook modern response. It was also a guaranteed method to die slowly and predictably. I countermanded his order instantly. I instructed Weaver to abandon the armored vehicles completely. Our virtual troops were ordered to sprint directly toward the base of the unstable eastern clay slope. The command room erupted in protests. Leaving heavy armor to stand in the open mud was considered tactical suicide. The artificial intelligence flagged my order as a critical user error and requested confirmation. Weaver looked at my calm expression and pressed the confirm button without flinching. She had bypassed the point of no return. She was now officially insubordinate to modern doctrine and loyal only to my logic. The virtual troops abandoned their steel covers and moved into the open. The Phantom forces immediately concentrated all heavy fire on the exposed infantry. Casualties spiked to 22% in seconds. Miller began logging my orders into a digital failure report. He was already preparing the documentation required for my execution. I watched the holographic display as our troops reached the designated coordinates. I ordered Weaver to initiate Phase 2. The virtual soldiers were instructed to use their heavy explosives not against the enemy forces but directly into the base of the eastern clay slope above their own heads. Richards finally stepped forward demanding an explanation. Firing explosives into a steep incline directly above your own position violates every basic rule of self-preservation and military safety protocols. I stated facts instead of opinions. The explosives would shatter the smooth shale foundation. The high humidity and impending rain would instantly liquefy the 42% clay composition into heavy sludge. I ordered Weaver to execute the explosive command. The virtual soldiers fired their heavy munitions into the dirt. The holographic mountain shuddered violently as the internal structural integrity completely failed. A massive digital landslide triggered on the screen. Thousands of tons of simulated earth and rocks cascaded downward. It completely buried the central road and crushed our abandoned armored vehicles instantly. Miller shouted that I had just destroyed our own objective. The convoy was buried. The mission parameters strictly required the defense of those vehicles. He declared the simulation a total operational failure. I corrected his limited understanding of warfare. A destroyed vehicle cannot be captured. By destroying the objective myself, I had instantly eliminated the primary reason for the enemy to maintain their position. The landslide created a massive wall of debris, blocking the narrow canyon. It fundamentally altered the topography of the battlefield. The Phantom forces were now split into two completely isolated operational groups. Phase 3 required precise timing. The artificial weather system triggered the heavy rain I had calculated earlier. The digital environment flooded with water, turning the fresh landslide into an impassable swamp. I ordered our surviving virtual infantry to deploy all available smoke canisters simultaneously into the heavy rain. The mixture of smoke and dense water vapor created an impenetrable visual barrier across the zone. The Phantom operatives were now physically separated by a mountain of mud and visually blinded by the smoke barrier. The machine registered the exact psychological penalty I had predicted 10 minutes earlier. Their combat cohesion dropped by 20%. Without visual contact or a clear objective, they began firing randomly into the smoke. They were wasting precious ammunition on a target that no longer existed. Our virtual troops were positioned safely at the extreme edge of the landslide zone, completely hidden by the terrain anomaly. I ordered Weaver to hold all return fire to maintain absolute auditory concealment. We waited in digital silence. The cost of this maneuver was high. I had sacrificed the entire convoy and 22% of my infantry. The profit was absolute control over the current battlefield conditions. The Phantom forces panicked in the blind environment. The simulation artificial intelligence could not calculate a logical response to an enemy that intentionally destroyed its own objective and vanished into the mud. The isolated northern group of Phantoms began retreating to higher ground, fearing a counterattack from the smoke. The southern group mistakenly identified the retreating footsteps as our advance and opened heavy fire. The enemy forces were now actively destroying each other in the confusion. I had weaponized their own superior firepower against them using only dirt water and carefully calculated psychological manipulation. The command room remained completely silent as the digital casualty report scrolled rapidly across the main screen. The Phantom numbers plummeted as friendly fire incidents decimated their heavily armed ranks. Miller stared at his monitor with an open mouth. His perfect tactical algorithm was breaking down because it could not comprehend a strategy built entirely on self-sabotage and environmental exploitation. I waited exactly 4 minutes until the enemy-friendly fire ceased. Their ammunition reserves were severely depleted and their formation was completely broken. It was time to harvest the resulting profit. I ordered Weaver to initiate the final phase. Our surviving 78 virtual soldiers were instructed to fix bayonets and charge directly through the dissipating smoke into the disorganized southern group. The artificial intelligence calculated the outcome in milliseconds. Our forces engaged in brutal close-quarters digital combat against an enemy that possessed empty rifles and shattered psychological cohesion. The tactical map rapidly shifted from red to blue. The virtual slaughter was incredibly efficient. Superior technology means absolutely nothing when the operator is exhausted, confused, and staring at cold steel. The simulation clock stopped abruptly. A loud chime echoed through the command room. The massive central holographic display flashed a bright green text confirming the immediate cessation of all hostile activities. I reviewed the final resource calculations on the terminal. I had expended 1 convoy and 22 infantry units. I had successfully eliminated 940 Phantom operatives in a single engagement. The artificial intelligence generated the final evaluation report. The system displayed a victory status with a strategic efficiency rating that broke the standard metrics of the modern military evaluation algorithm. Weaver leaned back in her chair and exhaled a long breath. She had gambled her entire professional existence on my ancient logic, and she had just received an astronomical return on her initial operational investment. Richards walked slowly toward the holographic table. He looked at the casualty reports and then looked directly at me. He understood that he was no longer observing a failed experiment or a simple historical asset. I stood completely still and maintained my neutral expression. I had successfully secured my primary subordinate and established a dominant position within their digital system using pure mathematical violence. The bright green text confirming my absolute tactical victory remained brightly illuminated on the massive central screen. The artificial intelligence system calculated my final strategy at exactly 1,100% operational efficiency. Lieutenant Miller immediately submitted a formal verbal protest claiming I had illegally exploited a fundamental glitch in the simulation physics engine. He violently refused to accept that primitive psychological manipulation could defeat heavy modern armor. Colonel Richards completely ignored his desperate complaint and focused entirely on the raw mathematical data displayed on the terminal. The machine clearly indicated that 0 modern commanders had ever achieved this specific numerical result. Richards turned slowly toward me and officially designated my status as a primary tactical asset. He verbally transferred full control of the secondary command room directly to my operational authority, effective immediately. I had successfully acquired my very first piece of physical territory in this strange new era. The secondary command center contained 20 individual analyst stations and 5 high-resolution holographic projectors, which constituted my new stronghold. I systematically evaluated the physical room layout and found the current configuration completely unacceptable for rapid command execution. The workstations were arranged in random scattered clusters that created severe audio communication delays. I ordered Dr. Weaver to initiate a total physical reorganization of the entire facility. I specifically required a centralized circular formation where every single subordinate maintained direct visual contact with my primary elevated position. Several digital technicians protested the intense physical labor, complaining loudly about disrupted power cables and broken network connections. I calculated their immediate complaints as a temporary morale deficit strictly required for long-term profit. A command structure that cannot rapidly adapt to basic physical restructuring will inevitably collapse during actual high-pressure combat. I instructed Weaver to permanently terminate the network access of any technician who refused to move their heavy metal desk. The direct threat of losing their security clearances instantly neutralized the internal resistance. The analysts pushed their heavy metal desks into the circular formation exactly as I had originally specified on the digital tactical map. The reorganization of the secondary command center required exactly 14 minutes to complete. The 20 analysts now sat in a perfect circular formation facing my central holographic projection table ready for operation. I officially designated this room as my primary operational base. I possessed 20 human units capable of processing digital intelligence, but their current psychological conditioning lacked the required rigid martial discipline. I ordered Weaver to formally evaluate the specific cognitive processing speed of each individual analyst. I desperately needed to identify the weakest links in my new digital army before engaging in any live tactical operations against the enemy forces. Weaver quickly reported that 3 specific analysts demonstrated a 25% slower response time when handling raw atmospheric data. I immediately ordered their permanent removal from the primary intelligence processing circle. Lieutenant Miller loudly objected to my personnel adjustments, stating I completely lacked the legal authority to dismiss trained military technicians. I ignored his protest and forcefully replaced the 3 individuals with experienced logistics specialists. A strategist must violently cull operational inefficiency from the system. Maintaining slow units out of sentimentality guarantees a catastrophic failure during high-speed combat where mere milliseconds determine absolute biological survival. My personnel economy now operated at maximum possible efficiency given the severely limited available human resources. I instructed the remaining 17 analysts to carefully synchronize their data streams directly into Weaver's master terminal. The main facility alarms suddenly activated with a deafening volume. Flashing crimson warning lights intensely illuminated my newly organized command center, indicating an immediate and severe real-world combat emergency. Colonel Richards burst violently through the heavy metal doors, carrying a physical paper intelligence report. His heart rate was visibly elevated, and his facial microexpressions displayed a complete loss of strategic control. He slammed the document onto my holographic table and desperately demanded my immediate tactical attention. An elite special operations unit designated as Delta Squad had just been ambushed by a massive enemy force in Sector 7. I reviewed the paper document and identified the geographical coordinates of Sector 7. It was a steep, rocky ravine, completely identical to the digital topography I had just utilized to crush Miller's tactical simulation. The artificial intelligence system calculated the immediate survival probability of the trapped soldiers at 14% based on standard military doctrine. The enemy forces possessed absolute high ground advantage and heavy explosive artillery. Richards grabbed my shoulder and formally ordered me to assume direct command of the ongoing extraction operation. He explicitly stated that all standard rescue protocols had completely failed, resulting in a massive spike in Allied casualties. I accepted the operational transfer, securing my first opportunity to test my historical strategies against living human targets. I stepped onto the elevated central platform and ordered the analysts to display the real-time satellite feed. The holographic projector illuminated the rocky terrain, revealing 30 Allied soldiers completely pinned down behind destroyed transport vehicles. 60 enemy operatives systematically bombarded their position utilizing heavy mortar tubes. I calculated the resource economics of the current battlefield scenario. 30 units possessed limited ammunition and 0 mobility. 60 enemy units possessed infinite ammunition and absolute positional superiority. Engaging in a sustained direct firefight would yield a 0% chance of survival. I needed to fundamentally alter the battlefield geometry to neutralize the enemy firepower advantage without expending additional Allied resources. I ordered Weaver to open a direct encrypted audio channel to the Delta Squad commander on the ground. I instructed her to bypass all standard communication protocols to minimize the transmission delay to exactly 0.3 seconds. The audio channel activated, broadcasting the chaotic sounds of heavy explosions and screaming wounded soldiers. I identified the voice of the commander issuing desperate orders to maintain a static defensive perimeter around the vehicles. Maintaining a static position against heavy artillery is a mathematical guarantee of total unit annihilation. I pressed the transmission button and ordered the commander to immediately abandon the destroyed vehicles and initiate a rapid northern retreat. The commander hesitated, citing standard military doctrine that strictly prohibited abandoning heavy equipment during an active firefight. I calculated his hesitation as a 3% reduction in overall unit survival probability. I spoke clearly, overriding his tactical programming with absolute authority. I explained that steel can be easily replaced, but trained human capital represents an irreplaceable operational asset. I demanded immediate compliance with the retreat order. He finally acknowledged the command and ordered his squad to fall back. The Allied units broke their defensive perimeter and sprinted desperately toward the narrow northern exit of the rocky ravine. The enemy mortar teams instantly recognized the sudden tactical shift. They rapidly recalculated their firing trajectories, aiming directly at the narrow northern choke point to annihilate the retreating Allied forces completely. I anticipated their mathematical adjustment. I ordered Weaver to locate the nearest Allied artillery battery and transmit a highly specific set of targeting coordinates. I did not target the enemy soldiers, but aimed precisely at the eastern cliff face above the choke point. Miller screamed that my artillery coordinates were completely wrong. He argued that the explosive shells would entirely miss the enemy forces and strike the empty rocks directly above our retreating soldiers. I ignored his rudimentary tactical understanding. A direct strike on dispersed enemy units yields a low casualty percentage. A direct strike on unstable geological formations creates an environmental weapon with absolute destructive capability. The Allied artillery battery fired exactly 12 high explosive shells toward the designated coordinates. The projectiles impacted the eastern cliff face precisely 2 seconds before Delta Squad reached the narrow northern choke point. The massive explosions completely shattered the structural integrity of the ancient rock formation. Thousands of tons of heavy granite and loose gravel violently collapsed downward, creating an impenetrable physical barrier across the ravine. The falling debris perfectly shielded the retreating Allied forces from the incoming enemy mortar fire. The heavy enemy explosives detonated harmlessly against the massive wall of solid rock, completely neutralizing their primary tactical advantage. I had successfully purchased absolute physical safety for 30 human units by spending exactly 12 artillery shells. The operational profit margin of this specific transaction exceeded all modern military algorithmic calculations. The Delta Squad commander reported that his entire unit had successfully crossed into the safe zone with 0 additional casualties. The artificial intelligence immediately updated the survival probability metric to a solid 92%. My analysts erupted in spontaneous cheers, violating my strict protocol regarding emotional neutrality within the command center. I allowed the momentary celebration because it rapidly solidified their absolute loyalty to my unconventional command structure. Richard stared at the holographic projection of the newly created rock wall. He completely understood that my historical understanding of environmental manipulation far exceeded the rigid parameters of modern technological warfare. I turned to Weaver and instructed her to permanently record this specific tactical maneuver in our operational database. The application of geological weapons against conventional artillery was now established as a primary defensive protocol. The successful infantry extraction completely shifted the internal political balance of the military facility. I immediately utilized this newly acquired authority to secure additional physical operational resources. I required absolute control over the primary data server processing the satellite imagery. Colonel Richards hesitated before granting my command center exclusive priority access over the standard logistics department. Lieutenant Miller loudly complained that prioritizing my tactical unit would severely delay standard base supply deliveries. I calculated the acceptable delay at exactly 72 hours before base morale degraded. A temporary reduction in food quality represents an acceptable operational expense when purchasing superior battlefield intelligence. I overrode his logistical protest and secured the requested satellite server access. My newly formed intelligence mechanism now consisted of 17 specialized analysts and 1 highly advanced digital server. I divided the human capital into 3 distinct functional groups to maximize output speed. Group Alpha contained 7 analysts dedicated entirely to tracking enemy troop movements. Group Beta contained 5 analysts focused strictly on monitoring Allied supply lines and calculating our weapon expenditures. Group Gamma consisted of the remaining 5 analysts assigned to process local topographical shifts. Weaver served as the central node, consolidating their raw data streams into actionable strategic combat projections. I established a strict operational quota requiring each analyst to process 50 intelligence packets per hour. Any subordinate failing to meet this mathematical standard would face immediate reduction in daily rations. Modern military culture relies heavily on positive reinforcement to maintain operational morale. Ancient warfare relies entirely on the absolute fear of starvation and physical punishment to guarantee peak performance. One younger analyst immediately failed to process his assigned topographical data within the required time limit. I ordered Weaver to lock his digital terminal and permanently revoke his access to the primary cafeteria. The other 16 analysts immediately increased their processing speed by an average of 8%. The simple application of negative reinforcement created a massive and instantaneous surge in operational efficiency. I then established a reward economy by offering additional food rations to the top-performing analyst each cycle. This created a highly competitive internal environment that pushed my human capital to its absolute biological limits. The constant flow of high-quality intelligence revealed a massive logistical flaw in the enemy Phantom network. They relied heavily on a single undefended desert highway to transport all heavy artillery ammunition. I calculated that a successful surgical strike against this specific logistical choke point would reduce enemy combat effectiveness by 40%. A direct confrontation would be mathematically suicidal with my current resources. I required a small, highly specialized team to execute a stealth infiltration mission deep into enemy territory. The standard military personnel lacked the required physical conditioning and psychological discipline for the task. I reviewed the personnel files of the 28 soldiers from Delta Squad who had survived the ravine ambush. They possessed direct combat experience against the Phantoms and a high level of psychological resilience. I requested that Richards permanently transfer the entire Delta Squad directly to my command authority. He immediately approved the transfer, hoping to replicate the success of the previous geological warfare operation. The Delta Squad soldiers entered my circular command center expecting a standard mission briefing and advanced equipment. I ordered them to immediately strip off all heavy armor and communication devices before speaking. Their commander vehemently objected to the order, stating his unit required heavy armor to survive in a high-explosive environment. I pointed to the glowing holographic display showing my previous simulation victory. The digital log clearly demonstrated that heavy armor guarantees a slow and predictable death against a mobile enemy. The Delta commander analyzed the data and finally ordered his men to comply with my unconventional demand. I handed each soldier a simple cloth garment soaked in a chemical solution designed to mask human thermal signatures. Their previous $100,000 combat suits were replaced by ancient camouflage techniques. I then ordered the confiscation of their advanced laser-guided rifles and replaced them with older kinetic models. The modern rifles contained tracking chips that the Phantom forces could easily exploit during a stealth operation. The soldiers stared at the obsolete weapons with open disgust and disbelief. I explained that a weapon without a digital signature is invisible to the enemy, making it the superior tactical choice for this specific mission. I possessed 28 highly trained soldiers equipped with low-technology weapons and primitive camouflage. This constituted the foundation of my first elite asymmetrical warfare unit completely loyal to my command. I designated their first mission as Operation Serpent Fang. The objective was the complete annihilation of the Phantom logistical convoy traveling along the undefended desert highway I had previously identified on the map. Weaver calculated the optimal ambush point exactly 70 miles inside hostile territory. The location featured a series of high sand dunes that offered excellent natural cover for a small infantry force without heavy armor. We deployed from the military base utilizing 3 unmarked civilian transport vehicles to avoid enemy satellite detection. We traveled for 6 hours under complete radio silence to maintain absolute operational secrecy. We disembarked 5 miles from the designated ambush point and proceeded on foot through the dark desert night. The thermal masking solution perfectly concealed our body heat from the Phantom surveillance drones patrolling the area. We reached the high sand dunes and established a linear ambush formation overlooking the highway. I possessed 28 soldiers with a limited ammunition supply facing a heavily armed convoy of unknown size and composition. The first Phantom supply vehicle appeared on the horizon exactly at dawn. It was a massive armored truck protected by 2 smaller, heavily armed escort vehicles equipped with mounted machine guns. This was a hard target. The artificial intelligence in the command center would have calculated our victory probability at less than 5%. A direct firefight against armored targets with only kinetic rifles is mathematically inefficient and costly. I had absolutely no intention of engaging in a direct firefight. I ordered 10 of my soldiers to bury themselves in the sand directly in the path of the approaching convoy, leaving only their rifle barrels exposed. The remaining 18 soldiers positioned themselves on the high dunes to provide suppressive fire from an elevated position. I had created a classic 3-point kill zone designed to maximize enemy confusion and panic. The lead Phantom escort vehicle approached the buried soldiers completely unaware of the impending physical trap. The driver focused entirely on the high dunes, assuming any potential threat would originate from the obvious high ground. I gave the silent hand signal to initiate the ambush precisely when the lead vehicle entered the kill zone. The 10 buried soldiers simultaneously fired their kinetic rifles directly into the thin rubber tires of the escort vehicle. The tires exploded instantly, causing the heavy vehicle to swerve violently and crash directly into the central armored truck. The resulting collision completely blocked the narrow desert highway, creating a perfect logistical choke point. The second escort vehicle frantically attempted to reverse, but its path was blocked by the burning wreckage. The Phantom soldiers inside were now trapped in a perfect linear kill box with zero mobility and limited fields of fire. I signaled the 18 soldiers on the dunes to initiate the second phase of the ambush. They unleashed a concentrated volley of fire directly into the exposed cabin of the second escort vehicle, eliminating the driver instantly. The panicked Phantom soldiers scrambled out of their disabled vehicles and attempted to establish a defensive perimeter. They fired their weapons wildly into the high dunes, completely ignoring the 10 hidden soldiers at ground level. My buried operatives opened fire again, this time targeting the exposed backs of the enemy soldiers. The Phantoms were now trapped in a brutal crossfire, taking heavy casualties from two directions simultaneously with zero available cover. The entire engagement lasted exactly 4 minutes and cost only 120 bullets. We successfully eliminated 20 Phantom operatives and captured a massive armored truck filled with high-explosive artillery shells. The operational profit from this single engagement was astronomical. We had completely crippled the Phantom artillery capabilities in the entire western sector without suffering a single casualty or expending any valuable military resources. I ordered the Delta Squad soldiers to transfer the captured explosives into our civilian transport vehicles. We rigged the empty Phantom truck with a remote detonator and left it as a psychological calling card on the highway. We returned to the military base just as the Phantom recovery teams arrived at the ambush site. I remotely triggered the detonator, completely vaporizing the wreckage and the enemy recovery personnel in a massive secondary explosion. This secondary psychological strike sent a clear and undeniable message to the Phantom commander. A new and completely unpredictable tactical entity had entered the battlefield that did not adhere to modern rules of engagement. Richards and Miller met us at the base entrance, staring at the massive pile of captured explosives with absolute disbelief. I had successfully transformed a simple extraction squad into a highly profitable asymmetrical warfare machine. The artificial intelligence system analyzed the combat data and upgraded my official tactical rating. I had now surpassed the highest recorded scores of any living modern commander in their entire global military database. My authority within the military facility was now absolute and completely unchallenged. I possessed one elite combat unit and a highly efficient intelligence network, giving me complete control over the local tactical environment. Weaver reported that the Phantom communication networks had gone completely silent following the destruction of the convoy. The enemy commander was now forced to reevaluate his entire logistical strategy due to my single surgical strike. I used this temporary operational pause to further refine my new combat unit. I integrated the captured Phantom weapons into their training regimen, forcing them to master the technological tools of their primary adversary. A warrior who understands his enemy's weapon is twice as difficult to kill in a direct confrontation. I also initiated a series of brutal hand-to-hand combat exercises to prepare them for zero ammunition scenarios in the future. My base of operations was now a highly efficient mechanism for converting raw human capital into elite military assets. The 17 analysts processed intelligence while the 28 Delta operatives executed my ancient tactical commands. The physical layout of the command center now perfectly mirrored my strategic philosophy. I stood at the central elevated platform, observing the circular formation of my subordinates processing data like a living machine. The base was no longer a simple military installation, but a complex weapon system with me as its central processing unit. The human and digital components were now fully integrated into a single, cohesive tactical entity. I had successfully expanded my initial zero-resource position into a small but highly lethal operational territory. I now possessed the required assets to transition from defensive maneuvers to a direct offensive campaign against the Phantoms. Weaver suddenly detected a highly encrypted data burst originating from deep within the Phantom network. The signal was not a standard logistical communication, but a direct personal message addressed to the base command. The artificial intelligence system struggled to break the advanced encryption, but Weaver utilized a series of logical backdoors. She successfully decrypted the message and displayed the raw text on the central holographic projector. The message contained only 2 words. It was my family name from the 18th century. The Phantom commander had successfully identified my true historical identity by analyzing my unique tactical signature on the battlefield. I stared at the glowing text, recognizing the severe implications of this intelligence breach. My duel with the Phantom commander had now escalated from a simple military conflict into a deeply personal and historical confrontation. The enemy now possessed a massive psychological advantage, knowing my entire history and tactical doctrine. He could now perfectly predict my future movements based on the extensive historical records of my ancient clan wars. This new information completely reset the tactical balance of power. My previous successes were based on the element of surprise, which was now completely nullified by the enemy's historical knowledge. I was now the predictable one. Richards and Miller stared at the holographic text in absolute confusion, unable to comprehend its historical significance. Only Weaver understood the catastrophic shift in the battlefield dynamics because she had studied my past. The artificial intelligence system immediately flagged a massive increase in phantom drone activity around our base perimeter. The enemy was no longer interested in our logistics, but was actively hunting for my physical location. I ordered an immediate lockdown of the entire command center and a complete communications blackout. I needed to sever all digital connections to the outside world to prevent the enemy from pinpointing my exact position. A new red warning indicator flashed on the screen indicating an internal security breach. A phantom operative had already infiltrated the base and was actively attempting to access the central personnel database. I had foolishly focused my entire attention on the external enemy, completely ignoring the possibility of an internal threat. The hunter had now become the hunted within my own newly constructed fortress of logic. The infiltrator was targeting the specific server that contained the biometric data of the Ancestor Echo project. If he succeeded, he would possess my exact physical description and a map of my daily movements within the facility. I possessed exactly 3 minutes to neutralize the internal threat before my identity was completely compromised. The Phantom operative was located in the primary logistics terminal on the opposite side of the massive military base. I ordered Richards to dispatch his heavily armed security teams to seal all exits from the logistics sector. I did not intend to capture the spy, but to simply contain him while I formulated a more permanent tactical solution. I analyzed the facility blueprint displayed on the central holographic table. The logistics terminal possessed 3 distinct exit routes leading to the external perimeter fence of the heavily fortified military compound. Richards deployed his security forces to block the 3 primary exits according to standard military containment protocols. I calculated this textbook response as fundamentally flawed against an elite Phantom infiltrator. A highly trained operative never utilizes designated escape routes during a full base lockdown. They utilize the structural blind spots created by the security forces rushing to cover the most obvious and predictable exit points. I isolated a secondary ventilation shaft that intersected the main water purification system near the northern wall. This route was completely ignored by the artificial intelligence because it required submersing into toxic chemical water. I detached myself from the central table and grabbed a heavy steel wrench from a nearby technician toolkit. A strategist must be willing to execute precise physical violence when digital commands prove to be too slow to react. I abandoned my command center and sprinted down the sterile white corridors toward the water purification room. I possessed 0 body armor and 0 firearms, relying entirely on my ancient physical conditioning and speed. I reached the heavy metal door of the purification facility and slowed my breathing to absolute silence. I calculated the exact trajectory of the spy moving through the complex ventilation network directly above my head. I entered the dark room filled with massive humming water tanks and various chemical storage units. The air smelled strongly of chlorine and raw ozone, masking any human scent that the infiltrator might accidentally leave behind. I crouched behind a steel generator and waited in perfect stillness. The resource cost of patience is 0, but the potential profit of a perfectly timed ambush is absolute control over the enemy intelligence network. A metallic grate above the primary water tank slowly unscrewed without making a sound. A figure dressed in black tactical gear dropped silently onto the concrete floor, holding a specialized digital extraction drive in his hand. The spy possessed superior modern weaponry, including a suppressed pistol and a long combat knife. I possessed a rusted steel wrench and the element of total surprise generated by my completely unpredictable physical movement. I calculated the precise distance between us at exactly 14 paces. The spy turned toward the secondary exit, completely ignoring my position because the artificial intelligence had not registered my physical presence. I launched myself forward using a low ancient sprinting technique that generated 0 footstep noise. I closed the distance in 2 seconds, bringing the heavy wrench down toward the weapon arm of the enemy operative. The spy possessed incredible reflexes, twisting away from my primary strike at the last possible millisecond. The heavy steel wrench smashed into the concrete floor, sending violent vibrations up my arm. I immediately calculated his counterattack vector based on his shifted body weight. He drew a suppressed pistol, aiming directly at my chest while stepping backward to maximize his technological advantage. I released the wrench and dove beneath his firing arc before his finger could compress the trigger. I swept his front leg, sweeping his foundation and forcing his center of gravity to collapse completely. His weapon discharged into the ceiling as he crashed onto the wet concrete. I secured his weapon arm, applying maximum joint pressure until the bones fractured loudly and the pistol dropped into the water. He attempted to deploy his combat knife using his left hand, but I struck his carotid artery with a precise blow. The sudden interruption of blood flow to his brain rendered him unconscious instantly. I retrieved the digital extraction drive from his tactical vest just as Richards and his heavily armed security team burst into the room. They pointed their advanced weapons at the neutralized threat. I handed the digital drive to Richards and instructed him to review the internal security protocols. His artificial intelligence had failed completely while my primitive physical logic secured the asset. The security commander stared at the broken infiltrator and then looked at my empty hands in absolute disbelief. A primitive subject had dismantled an elite modern operative using zero advanced technology. We returned to the secondary command center to analyze the recovered data drive. Weaver connected the device to an isolated terminal and bypassed the rudimentary phantom encryption algorithms in 2 minutes. The extracted file contained a massive logistical manifest detailing phantom troop movements across the western sector. The artificial intelligence calculated a routine enemy supply consolidation operation. I reviewed the specific cargo weights listed in the digital manifest and immediately identified a catastrophic mathematical error. The total explosive mass exceeded standard supply requirements by 10 times. I isolated the transportation routes and projected their final convergence point. The Phantom forces were not consolidating supplies, but actively staging a massive siege against our primary military base. I presented my calculations to Richards, demanding complete authority over base defenses. He hesitated, citing military regulations that prohibited transferring absolute command to an undocumented asset. I established a hard compromise. I requested a dedicated unit of 30 soldiers operating entirely outside the standard military hierarchy. I would forge them into an independent operational instrument. Richards evaluated the escalating threat level and agreed to the transaction. He granted me 30 infantrymen, but attached Lieutenant Miller as the unit commander to maintain a semblance of official oversight. I accepted Miller's presence as a necessary internal friction variable. I named the new specialized unit the Ronins, designating their absolute separation from the standard technological command structure. I ordered Weaver to filter the personnel files of 200 available candidates. I instructed her to ignore all weapon proficiency scores and focus entirely on psychological endurance and adaptability metrics. A soldier who relies entirely on a digital targeting system becomes useless when the battery fails. I required human assets capable of functioning effectively at absolute zero resource capacity. We assembled the 30 selected candidates in the primary training facility. They wore heavy combat armor and carried maximum ammunition loads, expecting a standard advanced tactical simulation exercise. I ordered them to strip off all ballistic armor communication devices and night vision equipment. I established the first rule of my unit, demanding absolute reliance on human senses rather than machinery. Miller immediately protested the order, stating that removing protective gear violated basic training safety protocols. He argued that I was intentionally degrading the combat effectiveness of his soldiers. I stepped directly into his personal space and issued a formal challenge. If his technological dependency represented true strength, he should demonstrate it by standing perfectly silent for 60 minutes. Miller scoffed and accepted the challenge, assuming the task was trivial. Within 14 minutes, his heavy armor caused severe thermal retention, resulting in involuntary physical movement and rapid breathing. I pointed out his failure to the 30 watching candidates. I explained that armor protects the body but destroys the ability to execute a silent ambush. Stealth is a superior defensive resource to steal. The candidates silently removed their advanced equipment, leaving only basic cloth uniforms and unloaded rifles. Their physical weight decreased by 40 pounds, granting them a massive increase in raw mobility. Phase 2 of the training focused on extreme caloric deprivation and sleep manipulation. I restricted their daily food intake to 800 calories and permitted only 3 random hours of sleep per cycle. Modern soldiers are conditioned to fight fully rested and heavily supplied. The Phantom operatives survive by fighting hungry and exhausted. We needed to match their biological baseline to predict their movements. By day 4, the Ronin unit experienced a severe drop in standard combat cohesion. 3 soldiers collapsed from exhaustion and were immediately expelled from the program, reducing my total force to 27. I considered the 3 lost units a profitable filtration mechanism. A brittle weapon shatters during the first strike, while a forged blade bends and returns to its original lethal geometry under high pressure. Miller struggled severely with the physical degradation. His arrogant demeanor vanished, replaced by a grim determination to survive the primitive conditions and prove my historical methods completely obsolete. We transitioned to practical camouflage exercises in the muddy terrain behind the military compound. I demonstrated how to alter human thermal signatures using a thick layer of cold clay and decaying vegetation. The artificial intelligence surveillance drones failed to detect 27 men buried in the mud from a distance of 50 paces. This technological failure proved the absolute superiority of ancient stealth. I ordered the unit to execute a mock raid on the primary base logistics depot utilizing zero digital communication. They coordinated their movements using only visual hand signals and ambient environmental noise. They successfully infiltrated the depot and marked 14 critical supply containers before the automated security systems registered their presence. The profit margin on this training exercise was astronomical. The base commander received the infiltration report and immediately upgraded the security clearance of the Ronin unit. I had successfully converted 27 standard infantrymen into elite asymmetrical assets. Weaver interrupted the final training cycle carrying a highly urgent intelligence update. The artificial intelligence had detected a massive phantom staging area exactly 40 miles north of our current position. Richards ordered an immediate preemptive strike utilizing the entire armored division. The machine calculated a 90% probability of crushing the enemy forces before they could launch their siege operation. I analyzed the satellite imagery of the staging area and identified a fatal geometric flaw. The enemy tents and supply vehicles were arranged in perfect symmetrical lines, violating their standard chaotic doctrine. Phantom operatives never organize their camps in predictable patterns unless they want to be observed by satellite cameras. The entire northern staging area was a calculated psychological trap designed by Cage. I explained the deception to Richards, but he refused to abort the preemptive strike. He trusted the real combat extraction of Delta Squad commenced immediately under my direct operational control. I possessed exactly 20 human operators and one highly advanced artificial intelligence system. I calculated the current survival probability of the trapped soldiers at 14% based on standard military doctrine. My new strategic overlay immediately elevated that metric to 60%. I instructed Weaver to transmit a series of highly unconventional movement orders to the Delta Squad commander. They were instructed to abandon their heavy communication gear to increase mobility speed. Lieutenant Miller argued that cutting communication equipment violated absolute command protocols. I silenced him by pointing at the thermal map showing enemy forces tracking their radio frequencies. Delta Squad dropped the heavy gear and their digital markers instantly vanished from the phantom tracking grid. The enemy artillery barrage completely missed the new coordinates by 400 meters. I established a new operational economy where raw speed was purchased by sacrificing technological safety nets. The trapped soldiers moved rapidly through the secondary canyon without drawing hostile fire. My 20 analysts processed the incoming topographical data, perfectly synchronizing with my physical command structure. The physical reorganization of the room yielded a 12% efficiency increase. Weaver reported that the Phantom operatives were attempting to regroup at the primary extraction point. I had already anticipated this standard interception tactic based on their previous behavior patterns. I ordered our artillery units to saturate the primary extraction point with heavy explosive munitions. We did not need to hit the enemy directly, but only needed to destroy the physical road network completely. The bombardment shattered the highway, leaving a massive crater that blocked all enemy mechanized reinforcements. Our primary extraction vehicle was redirected to a secondary hidden plateau 5 miles away. The artificial intelligence system updated the mission success probability to 89%. The analysts in the circular formation visibly relaxed, assuming the operational victory was already secured. I maintained strict emotional neutrality because anticipating premature victory is a fatal strategic error. The enemy commander possessed a human mind capable of adapting to sudden topographical changes. A red warning indicator flashed across the central holographic map. The artificial intelligence detected an anomalous enemy troop movement, completely bypassing our newly created artillery crater zone. Weaver rapidly enhanced the satellite feed, revealing a secondary Phantom unit scaling the eastern cliff face. They utilized advanced climbing equipment that generated zero thermal signatures on the scanners. The enemy commander had accurately deduced our secondary extraction point within exactly 4 minutes. This rapid recalculation indicated a tactical intellect far superior to standard terrorist operations. I demanded the immediate behavioral profile of the Phantom leader coordinating this specific sector. The artificial intelligence retrieved a highly classified file designated only by the single word Keiji. Keiga possessed a 94% operational success rate against modern armored divisions. His tactical patterns showed a distinct preference for psychological manipulation and heavy infantry traps. The Phantom climbing unit reached the summit and immediately established overlapping fields of heavy machine gun fire. They effectively trapped Delta Squad in a shallow depression 2 miles from safety. The survival probability plummeted from 89% down to 22% in less than 60 seconds. Miller loudly declared the operation a catastrophic failure due to my unorthodox methods. I ignored the internal panic and focused entirely on the resource mathematics of the current battlefield. I possessed 20 Allied soldiers pinned down by 40 heavily armed Phantom operatives on high ground. Engaging in a sustained firefight from a low elevation yields a 0% chance of survival. Delta Squad possessed limited ammunition and 0 heavy explosives to dislodge the entrenched enemy position. I required a diversionary tactic substantial enough to break the enemy firing line for exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes provided sufficient time for the transport helicopter to extract the main element. I analyzed the topographical map, searching for environmental vulnerabilities near the Phantom position. The eastern cliff consisted of solid granite, offering 0 opportunities for an engineered landslide. The environment offered no solutions, so I shifted my calculations entirely toward human capital expenditure. I needed to purchase extraction time using the only available currency on the digital battlefield. I isolated 2 specific soldiers within the Delta Squad formation positioned nearest to the enemy flank. They possessed the last remaining smoke grenades and 2 highly advanced light machine guns. I ordered Weaver to open a direct and encrypted audio channel to the Delta Squad commander on the ground. I needed to transmit an absolute command without triggering an emotional debate over the radio. I instructed the commander to detach his 2 rearguard operatives and order them to charge the enemy flank. They were to deploy all remaining smoke and initiate maximum suppressive fire immediately. Weaver stopped typing and stared at my face in absolute horror. She understood the mathematical reality of my tactical order. Charging an entrenched heavy machine gun position was guaranteed suicide. She refused to transmit the order, citing modern military protocols regarding acceptable casualty rates. She argued that we must deploy air support to suppress the enemy regardless of the weather conditions. I calculated the arrival time of the nearest aerial support unit at exactly 14 minutes. Delta Squad would exhaust their ammunition and face total annihilation within the next 4 operational minutes. A commander who attempts to save every single soldier will inevitably lose the entire army. Sacrificing 2 units to guarantee the survival of 18 units represents a highly profitable strategic exchange. I leaned over the console and bypassed Weaver's security lock using my newly acquired command authority. I pressed the transmission button and spoke the cold tactical order directly into the communication grid. The Delta Squad commander received the instruction and hesitated for precisely 2 seconds. His combat experience validated my mathematical calculation despite the severe psychological cost of the maneuver. The 2 designated soldiers broke from the main defensive formation and sprinted toward the rocky incline. They triggered 6 smoke canisters simultaneously, creating a dense visual barrier across the ridge. The Phantom operatives instantly shifted their heavy machine guns toward the sudden aggressive movement. They assumed the smokescreen concealed a massive counterattack from the entire trapped squad. The 2 soldiers unleashed their light machine guns blindly into the enemy position, drawing all hostile fire. The remaining 18 members of Delta Squad immediately broke cover and sprinted for the helicopter. The holographic map displayed the real-time biological data of the 2 rearguard soldiers. Their heart rates spiked massively as they absorbed multiple high-caliber rounds from the entrenched Phantom forces. The first soldier collapsed after 30 seconds of sustained combat, having expended all his ammunition. His biological monitor flatlined instantly, turning his blue digital icon into a stark black cross. The second soldier maintained suppressive fire for another 40 seconds before suffering a catastrophic chest wound. His icon turned black, securing exactly 1 minute and 10 seconds of absolute distraction. The 18 surviving members of Delta Squad successfully boarded the extraction helicopter during the chaos. The pilot executed a rapid vertical ascent, completely avoiding the disorganized enemy fire. I terminated the communication channel and stepped back from the holographic projection table. The resource transaction was completely finalized, resulting in an 80% survival rate for the unit. The secondary command center descended into absolute silence. The 20 analysts stared at their screens, processing the cold reality of my tactical command. I had deliberately murdered 2 Allied soldiers. Weaver covered her mouth with her hands, fighting a severe emotional reaction to the digital casualty reports. She had never witnessed a commander actively choose death as a primary tactical instrument before. Colonel Richards walked slowly toward the central table, analyzing the final artificial intelligence summary. The machine calculated my operational efficiency at 940% above standard. The system explicitly noted that any alternative strategy would have resulted in a 100% casualty rate. My ruthless mathematical sacrifice was objectively the only path to a successful extraction. Richards looked at me with a complex mixture of profound respect and deep moral revulsion. He recognized my undeniable military genius, but completely rejected my lack of modern human compassion. Lieutenant Miller remained silent for the first time since my arrival at the military facility. He finally understood that he was not competing against a primitive savage, but against a pure, tactical machine. A strategist cannot afford the luxury of guilt. Guilt clouds judgment and leads to hesitation in future engagements. I accepted the 2 lost units as a necessary operational expense to secure the primary asset. The external world immediately reacted to the sudden shift in modern military operational behavior. The Phantom communication networks lit up with highly encrypted data packets transferring across the region. Weaver intercepted a massive data burst originating from the specific eastern cliff where the ambush occurred. The enemy forces were transmitting the detailed combat logs directly to their supreme commander. I ordered the analysts to trace the destination of the encrypted Phantom data burst immediately. I needed to identify the exact location of the enemy command structure to formulate a preemptive strike plan. The artificial intelligence struggled to break the Phantom encryption layers due to their decentralized server architecture. The data bounced through 40 different civilian network nodes across the globe. I recognized this communication pattern from my previous life fighting guerrilla clans in the northern mountains. They were using a classic proxy relay system designed to obscure the true position of the leader. I instructed the analysts to ignore the global bounces and focus entirely on the signal degradation latency. By measuring the microscopic delays in the transmission, we could calculate the physical distance. The analysts applied my historical tracking logic to their advanced digital surveillance network. They successfully narrowed the signal destination to a heavily fortified bunker complex deep in the western desert. This was a massive strategic victory. The modern military had spent 3 years searching for the Phantom Central Command. My ancient logical framework located the facility in exactly 24 minutes. However, revealing my tactical methodology carried a severe reciprocal risk. The enemy commander Kaig was currently reviewing the exact same combat logs analyzing my deliberate sacrifice of the 2 soldiers. Keiji would immediately recognize that the modern army no longer operated under strict humanitarian algorithms. He would realize that a new apex predator had entered the strategic ecosystem of this modern war. Weaver translated a decrypted fragment of the Phantom communication intercept for my review. The message contained 0 operational data and consisted entirely of a single historical Japanese phrase. The phrase translated directly to "the tiger descends from the mountain to hunt the wolves." It was an ancient idiom used exclusively by my historical rivals during the bloody clan wars of the 18th century. I stared at the translated text on the glowing slate, feeling a sudden surge of ancient adrenaline. The enemy commander possessed deep knowledge of my specific historical era and my personal tactical doctrine. This was no longer a standard military conflict between modern nations and decentralized terrorist cells. The introduction of this specific idiom transformed the battlefield into a highly personalized duel. I calculated the probability of another temporal displacement anomaly occurring within the enemy ranks. The mathematics suggested a 0.01% chance, making it statistically almost impossible. The more logical conclusion was that Cage belonged to a lineage that explicitly studied my ancient campaigns. He was utilizing my own historical strategies against the modern military machine with great success. I ordered Weaver to initiate a total lockdown of our secondary command center network. If the enemy commander understood my historical identity, he would immediately target my physical location for elimination. The base security alarms activated again, but this time they indicated a severe internal breach. The artificial intelligence reported unauthorized data access originating from the primary logistics terminal. A Phantom operative had infiltrated the military base utilizing the chaos of the Delta Squad extraction as cover. They were actively downloading the personnel files associated with the Ancestor Echo project. I possessed exactly 3 minutes to neutralize the internal threat before my identity was fully compromised. I ordered Richards to dispatch his heavily armed security teams to the primary logistics sector. I analyzed the facility blueprint displayed on the central holographic table. The logistics terminal possessed 3 distinct exit routes leading to the external perimeter fence of the military compound. Richards deployed his security forces to block the 3 primary exits according to standard containment protocols. I calculated this textbook response as fundamentally flawed against an elite Phantom spy. A highly trained infiltrator never utilizes designated escape routes during a full base lockdown. They utilize the structural blind spots created by the security forces rushing to cover the obvious exits. I isolated a ventilation shaft intersecting the main water purification system near the northern wall. This route was completely ignored by the artificial intelligence because it required submersing into toxic water. I detached myself from the central table and grabbed a heavy steel wrench from a nearby technician toolkit. A strategist must be willing to execute precise physical violence when digital commands prove too slow. I abandoned the command center and sprinted down the sterile white corridors toward the water purification room. I possessed zero body armor and zero firearms, relying entirely on my ancient physical conditioning. I reached the heavy metal door of the purification facility and slowed my breathing to absolute silence. I calculated the exact trajectory of the spy moving through the complex ventilation network above my head. I entered the dark room filled with massive humming water tanks and chemical storage units. The air smelled strongly of chlorine and raw ozone, masking any human scent that the infiltrator might leave behind. I crouched behind a steel generator and waited in perfect stillness. The resource cost of patience is zero, but the potential profit of a perfectly timed ambush is absolute control over the enemy intelligence. A metallic grate above the primary water tank slowly unscrewed without a sound. A figure dressed in black tactical gear dropped silently onto the concrete floor holding a specialized digital extraction drive. The spy possessed superior modern weaponry, including a suppressed pistol and a combat knife. I possessed a rusted steel wrench and the element of total surprise generated by my unpredictable movement. I calculated the precise distance at exactly 14 paces. The spy turned toward the secondary exit, completely ignoring my position because the artificial intelligence had not registered my physical presence. I launched myself forward using a low ancient sprinting technique that generated zero footstep noise. I closed the distance in 2 seconds, bringing the heavy wrench down toward the weapon arm of the enemy. The spy possessed incredible reflexes, twisting away from my primary strike at the last. Possible millisecond. The heavy steel wrench smashed into the solid concrete floor, sending violent vibrations directly up my arm. I immediately calculated his counterattack vector based purely on his rapidly shifting body weight. He drew a suppressed pistol, aiming directly at my chest while stepping backward to maximize his technological advantage. I released the heavy wrench and dove completely beneath his firing arc before his finger could compress the trigger. I swept his front leg, destroying his physical foundation and forcing his center of gravity to collapse. His weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as his body crashed onto the wet concrete floor. I secured his weapon arm, applying maximum joint pressure until the bones fractured loudly and the pistol dropped away. He attempted to deploy a concealed combat knife using his left hand, but I struck his carotid artery with a precise blow. The sudden severe interruption of blood flow to his brain rendered the operative unconscious instantly. I retrieved the digital extraction drive from his tactical vest just as Richards and his heavily armed security team burst into the room. They pointed their advanced weapons at the completely neutralized phantom threat. I handed the tiny digital drive directly to Richards and instructed him to thoroughly review his internal security protocols. His artificial intelligence had failed completely while my primitive physical logic secured the asset. The base security commander stared at the broken infiltrator and then looked at my completely empty hands in absolute disbelief. A primitive subject had violently dismantled an elite modern operative using zero advanced technology. We quickly returned to the secondary command center to systematically analyze the recovered data drive. Weaver connected the device to an isolated terminal and bypassed the rudimentary phantom encryption algorithms in 2 minutes. The extracted digital file contained a massive logistical manifest detailing enemy phantom troop movements across the western sector. The base artificial intelligence calculated this as a routine enemy supply consolidation operation. I carefully reviewed the specific cargo weights listed in the digital manifest and immediately identified a catastrophic mathematical error. The total explosive mass exceeded standard supply requirements by a factor of 10. I isolated the various transportation routes and projected their final geographical convergence point. The Phantom forces were absolutely not consolidating supplies, but actively staging a massive siege against our primary military base. I presented my harsh calculations to Richards, demanding complete tactical authority over the physical base defenses. He hesitated, citing strict military regulations that formally prohibited transferring absolute command to an undocumented asset. I quickly established a hard strategic compromise, recognizing his political limitations. I requested a dedicated unit of 30 soldiers operating entirely outside the standard military hierarchy to function as my independent instrument. Richards evaluated the rapidly escalating threat level and agreed to the unprecedented transaction. He granted me 30 trained infantrymen, but permanently attached Lieutenant Miller as the unit commander to maintain official oversight. I completely accepted Miller's annoying presence as a strictly necessary internal friction variable. I formally named the new specialized unit the Ronins, designating their absolute and complete separation from the standard technological command. I ordered Weaver to algorithmically filter the personnel files of 200 available military candidates. I instructed her to completely ignore all weapon proficiency scores and focus entirely on psychological endurance and adaptability metrics. A modern soldier who relies entirely on a digital targeting system becomes completely useless when the internal battery fails. I required raw human assets fully capable of functioning effectively at absolute zero technological resource capacity. We quickly assembled the 30 selected candidates in the massive primary training facility. They wore heavy combat armor and carried maximum ammunition loads, expecting a highly standard advanced tactical combat simulation exercise. I ordered them to completely strip off all ballistic armor digital communication devices and thermal night vision equipment. I established the first absolute rule of my unit, demanding total reliance on basic human senses rather than machinery. Miller immediately protested the unconventional order, stating that removing protective gear blatantly violated basic training safety protocols. He aggressively argued that I was intentionally degrading the combat effectiveness of his soldiers. I stepped directly into his physical space and issued a formal psychological challenge. If his technological dependency truly represented strength, he should easily demonstrate it by standing perfectly silent and still for exactly 60 minutes. Miller scoffed loudly and accepted the challenge, assuming the physical task was completely trivial. Within 14 minutes, his heavy combat armor caused severe thermal retention, resulting in involuntary physical movement and rapid breathing. I pointed out his obvious physical failure to the 30 watching military candidates. I carefully explained that armor protects the soft body but completely destroys the ability to execute a silent ambush against a superior force. Total stealth represents a significantly superior defensive resource compared to thick steel plating. The candidates silently removed their advanced equipment, leaving only basic cloth uniforms and completely unloaded standard rifles. Their physical body weight decreased by 40 pounds, instantly granting them a massive increase in raw battlefield mobility. Phase 2 of the rigorous training focused on extreme caloric deprivation and severe sleep schedule manipulation. I strictly restricted their daily food intake to exactly 800 calories and permitted only 3 random hours of sleep per cycle. Modern soldiers are heavily conditioned to fight fully rested and completely supplied with logistics. The Phantom operatives survive and dominate by fighting hungry, exhausted, and completely isolated from central command. We desperately needed to match their brutal biological baseline to accurately predict their erratic movements. By day 4, the experimental Ronin unit experienced a severe drop in standard combat cohesion. 3 soldiers collapsed from physical exhaustion and were immediately expelled from the program, reducing my total operational force to 27. I considered the 3 lost biological units a highly profitable operational filtration mechanism. A brittle iron weapon shatters completely during the first strike, while a forged steel blade bends and returns to its original lethal geometry. Miller struggled severely with the intense physical degradation and lack of calories. His previous arrogant demeanor vanished completely, replaced by a grim determination to survive the primitive conditions and prove my historical methods obsolete. We transitioned to practical camouflage exercises in the deep, muddy terrain located directly behind the military compound. I demonstrated how to completely alter human thermal signatures using a thick layer of cold clay and decaying vegetation. The advanced artificial intelligence surveillance drones completely failed to detect 27 men buried in the thick mud from a distance of 50 paces. This technological failure definitively proved the absolute superiority of ancient stealth. I ordered the newly trained unit to execute a mock raid on the primary base logistics depot utilizing zero digital communication. They flawlessly coordinated their silent movements using only visual hand signals and ambient environmental noise. They successfully infiltrated the secure depot and physically marked 14 critical supply containers before the automated security systems registered their presence. The operational profit margin on this training exercise was truly astronomical. The primary base commander received the infiltration report and immediately upgraded the security clearance of the Ronin unit. I had successfully converted 27 standard infantrymen into highly elite asymmetrical combat assets. Weaver suddenly interrupted the final physical training cycle, carrying a highly urgent digital intelligence update. The base artificial intelligence had detected a massive phantom staging area exactly 40 miles north of our current position. Richards aggressively ordered an immediate preemptive strike utilizing the entire heavy armored division. The central machine calculated a solid 90% probability of crushing the enemy forces before they could launch their siege operation. I carefully analyzed the raw satellite imagery of the staging area and identified a fatal geometric flaw. The enemy tents and heavy supply vehicles were arranged in perfect symmetrical lines, completely violating their standard chaotic doctrine. Phantom operatives never organize their hidden camps in predictable geometric patterns unless they actively want to be observed by satellite cameras. The entire northern staging area was a calculated psychological trap designed specifically by Cage. I quickly explained the obvious deception to Richards, but he completely refused to abort the massive preemptive strike. He foolishly trusted the artificial intelligence calculation far more than my primitive historical analysis of the enemy formation. He deployed 60 heavily armored vehicles directly into the northern mountain pass, completely ignoring my dire warnings. I calculated the absolute loss of those 60 vehicles as an inevitable operational expense caused by his strategic arrogance. I ordered Miller to immediately prepare the 27 Ronin operatives for a completely unsanctioned stealth deployment. While the main armored force marched blindly into a trap, we would secure the actual highly vulnerable southern supply route. Miller hesitated, recognizing that executing an unsanctioned combat deployment constituted severe military treason. I presented the simple resource mathematics showing that without our intervention, the base would completely fall within 48 hours. The lieutenant finally accepted the brutal logic and signaled the Ronin unit to prepare for immediate departure. We bypassed the primary security gates, using the exact same blind spots my team had exploited during the previous logistical training raid. We moved silently through the dark desert night, maintaining a strict physical distance of exactly 20 paces between each operative. We carried absolutely zero communication devices, relying entirely on visual contact and prearranged tactical formations. The ambient temperature dropped severely, but the clay coating on our uniforms perfectly insulated our body heat. We completely bypassed 3 heavily armed Phantom patrol units without triggering a single enemy thermal sensor or proximity alarm. We finally reached the southern mountain ridge overlooking the true Phantom staging area. This camp contained 0 symmetrical tents and instead utilized natural rock formations to conceal exactly 300 highly elite enemy operatives. I possessed 27 lightly armed soldiers facing 300 heavily armed veterans. The numerical deficit was approximately 1 to 11, representing a statistically impossible combat scenario, according to any standard military algorithm. I absolutely refused to engage in a direct physical confrontation against those overwhelming numbers. Our primary tactical objective was not total annihilation, but the complete destruction of their centralized heavy artillery ammunition stockpile. I visually identified the primary ammunition dump located exactly in the center of the rocky depression. It was heavily guarded by 40 operatives and completely surrounded by motion sensors that rendered standard stealth infiltration physically impossible. I required a massive external distraction to temporarily draw the 40 guards away from the explosive stockpile. I evaluated the surrounding environment and noticed a large natural reservoir positioned directly above the enemy encampment on the western slope. I quickly signaled Miller and directed his attention toward the massive concrete dam holding back the reservoir. The structure was old and completely undefended because the Phantom forces assumed it possessed 0 tactical value to a modern military force. I calculated the precise volume of water contained within the deep reservoir. Releasing that massive kinetic energy would create an artificial flood powerful enough to completely wash away the entire western flank of the enemy encampment. I detached 5 Ronin operatives and ordered them to scale the western slope and plant our remaining explosive charges directly on the dam structure. They possessed exactly 14 minutes to complete the climb and prime the detonators. The remaining 22 operatives positioned themselves along the eastern ridge, preparing to provide covering fire when the flood hit. We waited in absolute silence as the digital chronometer slowly ticked down toward the designated 0 hour. Suddenly, a massive explosion completely shattered the northern horizon, briefly illuminating the dark desert sky. Richard's armored division had just engaged the decoy camp and triggered the massive explosive trap I had warned him about previously. The loud, distant explosion caused massive confusion within the actual Phantom encampment directly below our position. The enemy commander began shouting rapid orders, completely redirecting his troops toward the northern ridge to investigate the blast. This unexpected external event created a highly profitable window of tactical opportunity. The heavy guard detail surrounding the primary ammunition stockpile was instantly reduced from 40 operatives down to exactly 12 operatives. The 5 designated Ronin operatives successfully reached the top of the concrete dam and signaled their physical readiness. I immediately gave the visual command to detonate the explosive charges, aiming to maximize the sudden structural failure. The heavy explosives detonated with a deafening roar, completely shattering the aging concrete barrier. Millions of gallons of dark cold water violently rushed down the steep western slope directly toward the highly disorganized Phantom encampment. The artificial flood hit the western flank with absolutely devastating kinetic force, completely crushing tents and flipping heavy vehicles. The sudden chaotic destruction instantly drew the attention of every single remaining guard in the central compound. I signaled Miller to initiate the primary infiltration phase while the enemy forces panicked over the flood. We rapidly descended the eastern ridge, moving silently through the deep shadows created by the flickering emergency lights in the camp. We easily bypassed the distracted remaining guards and successfully reached the central ammunition stockpile. I immediately ordered the operatives to plant highly volatile incendiary charges directly onto the massive stacks of artillery shells. We required exactly 2 minutes to wire the entire explosive cache for a single synchronized detonation. A Phantom patrol unit suddenly turned the corner and visually spotted our infiltration team, completely destroying our stealth advantage. They immediately raised their weapons to fire, but the Ronin operatives reacted with terrifying speed. We engaged the patrol using completely silent close-quarters combat techniques, utilizing combat knives to quickly neutralize the immediate threat. The silent physical engagement cost exactly 0 ammunition and generated 0 auditory alarm. We finished wiring the massive incendiary charges and rapidly retreated back toward the safety of the dark eastern ridge before additional patrols arrived. I triggered the remote detonator precisely as our final operative cleared the blast radius. The resulting massive explosion completely vaporized the entire central ammunition stockpile, sending a terrifying pillar of bright orange fire high into the dark sky. The secondary detonations completely leveled the remaining enemy structures and permanently neutralized their heavy artillery capabilities. The strategic profit from this specific operation was absolutely monumental compared to the minimal resources expended. We successfully retreated into the deep desert, completely disappearing before the surviving Phantom forces could mount any organized pursuit. I had officially delivered a massive and completely crippling tactical strike against the legendary Commander Cage. The massive explosion completely eliminated the immediate Phantom threat, but simultaneously exposed our physical position to the surviving enemy patrols. We possessed 0 transportation vehicles and very limited remaining ammunition. We successfully retreated exactly 5 miles before the first enemy pursuit drone identified our thermal signatures in the dark desert. The artificial intelligence immediately alerted the entire Phantom network to our location. I calculated the absolute physical exhaustion level of my 27 operatives at roughly 85%. A sustained forced march back to the primary military base would mathematically result in a total unit wipeout. I evaluated the topographical map displayed on Miller's wrist terminal and identified a highly defensible ruined structure 3 miles away. The structure was an abandoned concrete water treatment facility from a previous war. I ordered the Ronin unit to immediately alter their retreat vector toward the concrete ruins. Miller heavily protested the decision, arguing that trapping ourselves inside a static structure violated basic asymmetrical warfare rules. I forcefully reminded him that running across an open desert while being tracked by aerial drones yields a 0% survival rate. The concrete ruins offered a physical ceiling to neutralize their primary aerial advantage. We reached the abandoned facility exactly 14 minutes before the first heavily armed Phantom pursuit vehicles arrived. The concrete structure possessed thick walls and 3 highly defensible internal choke points. I immediately established a ruthless defensive economy, allocating our remaining ammunition with strict precision. Each operative received exactly 12 bullets, forcing them to prioritize absolute accuracy over basic suppressive fire. The enemy forces rapidly surrounded the facility, deploying 40 highly trained operatives to secure the primary entrance. They possessed heavy machine guns and a massive surplus of high explosive breaching charges. I ordered 5 Ronin operatives to construct a crude barricade using rusted metal pipes and broken concrete blocks. The barricade was intentionally designed to look incredibly weak to actively invite a direct frontal assault. The Phantom commander analyzed our crude defense and foolishly ordered his vanguard unit to breach the main doors immediately. He completely underestimated our tactical discipline based on his overwhelming numerical superiority. The vanguard breached the doors and rushed into the primary corridor, expecting scattered resistance and panic. My operatives maintained absolute silence, holding their fire until the enemy reached the designated kill zone. I gave the visual signal to engage, resulting in a highly concentrated volley of exactly 24 precise shots. The entire Phantom vanguard collapsed instantly, yielding a massive tactical profit for minimal ammunition expenditure. The enemy commander rapidly adjusted his strategy, recognizing that a simple frontal assault would prove too costly. He ordered his heavy weapons team to systematically demolish the exterior walls using their explosive charges. The massive explosions violently shook the ancient concrete foundation, creating multiple new entry points simultaneously. The artificial intelligence tracking system calculated a catastrophic drop in our defensive viability. I possessed 27 lightly armed operatives, now defending a severely compromised structure against 30 remaining enemies. The structural advantage was gone, forcing me to rely entirely on psychological manipulation. I ordered my operatives to completely abandon the ground floor and retreat into the subterranean maintenance tunnels. We left behind a highly visible trail of discarded equipment and fresh blood from minor superficial cuts. The Phantom forces eagerly followed the false trail, assuming we were executing a desperate and highly disorganized retreat. They marched blindly into the narrow subterranean tunnels, completely losing their numerical advantage. The dark, narrow corridors forced the enemy to advance in a single file line, entirely neutralizing their overlapping fields of fire. I had successfully converted their massive numerical superiority into a physical liability. I positioned my operatives at the intersecting tunnel junctions, creating overlapping crossfire zones in complete darkness. The Phantom forces possessed advanced night vision goggles, giving them a false sense of absolute security. I ordered Miller to detonate a small improvised explosive charge directly next to the primary electrical conduit. The resulting electromagnetic pulse instantly destroyed all advanced digital optics within a 50-meter radius. The sudden absolute darkness caused severe psychological panic among the elite enemy operatives. They were completely stripped of their technological crutches and forced to fight using only raw human senses in a confined space. My Ronin unit had spent the last 4 days training extensively in zero visibility conditions, using only ambient sound for targeting. We possessed absolute tactical supremacy in the dark, despite our severe ammunition shortage. We engaged the blinded enemy forces utilizing a highly coordinated series of silent melee strikes and point-blank shots. The chaotic skirmish cost exactly 14 bullets, yielding 20 eliminated Phantom operatives in 2 minutes. The remaining 10 Phantom soldiers completely broke formation and blindly retreated toward the surface level. Their previous arrogant aggression was entirely replaced by raw biological fear, generated by our primitive tactics. We systematically pursued the retreating operatives, eliminating them one by one as they struggled to navigate the dark tunnels. The total annihilation of the pursuit force yielded massive amounts of captured weapons and ammunition. I calculated the operational profit of this specific defensive engagement. We expended 0 allied lives and minimal ammunition while entirely destroying an elite enemy unit and securing a massive surplus of modern logistical supplies. Miller stared at the pile of captured weapons and slowly wiped the dirt from his face. He finally understood the absolute terrifying power of utilizing an environment to physically dismantle an enemy force piece by piece. Weaver suddenly contacted us through a captured enemy radio, indicating she had successfully bypassed the Phantom encryption again. She reported that Kaeg had just received the final combat logs detailing the total destruction of his pursuit force. The legendary enemy commander was reportedly furious and had ordered a massive mobilization of his remaining heavy armored units. He intended to personally lead a direct assault against our primary military base within 48 hours. I recognized this sudden aggressive mobilization as a highly emotional response, representing a fatal strategic error. A commander who abandons cold logic to pursue personal vengeance inevitably marches his entire army into a calculated trap. I ordered Miller to distribute the captured weapons and prepare the Ronin unit for an immediate return march to the primary base. We needed to rapidly construct a massive defensive system to welcome the impending armored assault. We arrived at the base perimeter exactly 6 hours later, carrying the captured Phantom supplies. Richards and his command staff greeted us with a mixture of immense relief and profound confusion regarding our complete lack of casualties. I completely ignored their questions and immediately requested full control over the primary engineering division. I needed to physically alter the entire topography surrounding the military base before Cage arrived with his heavy armor. Richards hesitated, citing the massive financial cost of deploying the heavy engineering equipment without formal Pentagon approval. I coldly presented the mathematical reality that a destroyed base possesses absolutely zero financial value. He finally authorized the massive logistical expenditure, granting me absolute command over 50 heavy construction vehicles and 200 engineers. I possessed exactly 36 hours to completely reshape the battlefield. I ordered the engineers to completely destroy the main paved highway leading toward the primary southern gate. They utilized heavy explosives to shatter the concrete, creating a massive impassable crater field exactly 2 miles wide. Miller loudly questioned the logic of destroying our own primary supply route. I carefully explained that a functional highway is highly profitable during peace, but represents a catastrophic fatal vulnerability during an active mechanical siege. The massive crater field forced the impending enemy armor to entirely abandon their high-speed linear approach. They would be forced to navigate the treacherous soft sand dunes, completely negating their primary tactical advantage of raw speed. I then ordered the construction vehicles to dig a massive network of deep trenches, completely surrounding the base perimeter. The trenches were designed not for defensive infantry positions, but as massive physical traps for heavy enemy vehicles. We utilized the remaining 24 hours to systematically fill the deep trenches with thousands of gallons of highly flammable aviation fuel. The engineers carefully covered the fuel pits with a thin layer of sand and brittle wooden planks. The artificial intelligence calculated the structural integrity of the disguised pits at exactly 0. Any heavy armored vehicle attempting to cross the sand would instantly break the planks and plunge directly into the deep, volatile fuel. Weaver continuously monitored the satellite feeds, tracking the massive phantom armored column slowly approaching from the south. The digital sensors indicated exactly 80 heavy tanks and 40 armored personnel carriers moving in a rigid formation. I possessed exactly 3,000 Allied infantrymen and 0 functional heavy tanks to defend the base. The numerical combat deficit was mathematically staggering, but the carefully constructed environmental traps heavily skewed the actual survival probability. The massive phantom armored column finally arrived at the southern perimeter exactly at dawn. The rising sun illuminated their thick steel plating and heavy cannons, creating a highly intimidating visual spectacle designed to induce panic. Cage halted his massive force exactly 1 mile from our primary defensive line. He deployed a highly advanced fleet of aerial surveillance drones to systematically map our visible defensive structures and identify potential tactical weaknesses. The advanced enemy drones completely failed to detect the massive subterranean fuel pits hidden beneath the thin layer of sand. Technology only analyzes the visible surface, completely ignoring the deadly primitive traps waiting just below. Cage analyzed the drone data and concluded that our defense relied entirely on the shattered concrete highway. He arrogantly ordered his heavy tanks to completely bypass the crater field and advance rapidly across the seemingly empty sand dunes. The massive steel behemoths accelerated toward our position, completely unaware of the impending environmental catastrophe. I stood perfectly still on the elevated command deck, observing their fatal geometric progression with cold mathematical satisfaction. I waited until exactly 40 heavy tanks had completely committed to crossing the designated sand dune kill zone. I possessed a very narrow temporal window to execute the primary trap before their commanders realized the tactical error. I gave the immediate visual signal to Miller, who stood waiting near the primary detonator switch. He forcefully compressed the heavy firing mechanism, sending a high-voltage electrical current directly into the hidden subterranean fuel pits. The massive underground explosion violently ruptured the surface of the desert, sending a terrifying wall of fire high into the air. The brittle wooden planks instantly shattered, plunging 40 heavy tanks directly into the blazing inferno. The intense thermal reaction immediately detonated the heavy artillery shells stored inside the trapped enemy vehicles. The resulting chain reaction completely vaporized the primary armored assault force in less than exactly 40 seconds. The surviving Phantom tanks frantically attempted to reverse their positions, completely destroying their own rigid tactical formation. The sudden absolute chaos caused massive friendly fire incidents as panicked gunners fired blindly through the thick black smoke. Cage had lost exactly 50% of his heavy armored division in a single brilliant logistical trap. His arrogant reliance on superior mechanical technology had completely blinded him to the basic primitive realities of the physical battlefield. I immediately ordered our 3,000 Allied infantrymen to launch a massive coordinated counterattack while the enemy was completely disorganized. The sudden aggressive push absolutely shattered the remaining Phantom morale, causing a rapid, uncoordinated retreat. The battle concluded with a massive and undeniable tactical victory for the Allied forces. I had successfully defended the primary base against impossible odds, expending exactly 0 Allied lives and utilizing only dirt and raw fuel. Richard stood on the command deck, completely paralyzed by the sheer scale of the calculated destruction. He finally understood that true military supremacy is not achieved through superior technology, but through the ruthless application of ancient strategic logic. The artificial intelligence finalized the post-combat damage assessment, projecting a 42% structural loss across the primary base perimeter. I considered this an acceptable operational cost. We had sacrificed concrete walls and peripheral sensor arrays to completely annihilate the primary Phantom armored force. The enemy sustained a 98% casualty rate within the fire pocket. Lieutenant Miller approached my central holographic table, carrying a physical casualty report. He previously would have shouted about the destroyed infrastructure, but his current demeanor was absolute silence. He placed the document on the terminal and formally requested permission to integrate his surviving regular infantrymen directly into my specialized Ronin unit. He had finally recognized actual tactical supremacy. I evaluated his request, calculating the logistical burden of retraining 50 conventional soldiers. I accepted his proposal on the condition that he completely forfeit his former rank and operate as a standard unit. Miller agreed without hesitation, proving his psychological transformation was permanent. I had successfully converted my primary internal obstacle into a highly compliant and experienced tactical subordinate. Colonel Richards entered the shattered command center accompanied by 3 high-ranking officials from the Pentagon. They stepped over the debris, completely ignoring the active repair operations in the corridors. Richards announced that the Global Military Command had officially reviewed the combat data from our defensive victory. They calculated my strategic efficiency at 3,000% above standard parameters. The Pentagon officials verbally transferred absolute operational control of the entire western sector directly to my authority. I now commanded 8,000 Allied troops and complete satellite network access. They officially designated my combat methodology as the Takeda Doctrine, ordering its immediate implementation across all active combat zones. I had elevated my status from a primitive experimental subject to a general. I possessed massive military authority but recognized the severe physical limitations of my new territory. The base was heavily damaged and the remaining Allied soldiers lacked my fundamental survival conditioning. I ordered the immediate suspension of all standard military training exercises across the sector. I mandated that every soldier undergo the exact same caloric deprivation and sleep manipulation regimen as my Ronin unit. The Pentagon officials heavily protested the massive disruption to standard operational protocols. They argued that degrading the physical condition of the entire Allied army would invite immediate enemy counterattacks. I silenced them by presenting the artificial intelligence casualty projections for standard combat operations. Without my primitive psychological conditioning, the entire army possessed a mere 12% survival rate. They surrendered to my mathematical logic and authorized the sweeping organizational changes. My primary objective was to forge 8,000 soft modern soldiers into a hardened weapon capable of hunting phantoms. Weaver interrupted the administrative transition, carrying a highly classified encrypted data drive. She had spent the last 48 hours analyzing the digital communications recovered from the destroyed Phantom tanks. She connected the drive to my isolated terminal, displaying a complex web of enemy logistical networks. The artificial intelligence had successfully isolated the primary transmission node utilized by the Phantom leader. The node was not located in a remote desert bunker, but hidden deep within a heavily populated civilian metropolis. Kaig was utilizing millions of innocent civilians as a massive biological shield against modern airstrikes. I analyzed the city blueprints, identifying exactly 3 potential locations capable of supporting a Phantom command center. 2 locations were highly visible industrial sectors, while the third was an ancient underground subway. A predictable modern commander would immediately target the industrial sectors based on standard probability models. I calculated that a true strategic genius would utilize the abandoned subterranean tunnels to maximize cover. I instructed Weaver to bypass the primary satellite surveillance and access the municipal thermal imaging grid. We needed to identify anomalous heat signatures radiating from the supposedly abandoned subterranean zones. The thermal scan revealed a massive spike in localized heat output directly beneath the central financial district. The heat signature perfectly matched the output of 50 high-capacity encrypted communication servers. We had successfully located the absolute core of the Phantom network. I ordered Miller to immediately assemble the expanded Ronin unit for a highly surgical urban infiltration mission deep into enemy territory. Richards warned me that executing a combat operation beneath a major civilian center carried massive political risks. Any collateral damage would result in the immediate termination of my command authority by the Pentagon. A strategist never allows political fear to dictate tactical necessity. I ignored his weak warnings and finalized the operational parameters, relying entirely on the extreme stealth capabilities of my newly forged operatives. We boarded 3 unmarked civilian transport vehicles, perfectly disguising our military presence from enemy observers. We arrived at the central financial district exactly at midnight, blending seamlessly into the urban environment. I isolated a heavily rusted maintenance hatch leading directly into the abandoned subway tunnels. We descended into the absolute darkness, leaving the bright neon lights of the modern city completely behind us. The tunnels were heavily rigged with highly advanced motion sensors and lethal laser tripwires. The enemy relied entirely on technology to secure their perimeter, completely ignoring the basic principles of physical patrols. I ordered the operatives to utilize their cold clay thermal masking and navigate the laser grid using primitive gymnastics. We completely bypassed their multi-million-dollar security system without triggering a single alarm. We reached the heavy steel doors of the primary Phantom command center completely undetected. I ordered my demolition specialist to utilize a silent thermal cutting tool instead of loud explosive breaching charges. The heavy doors slowly swung open, revealing a massive subterranean facility filled with advanced servers and tactical displays. 50 elite Phantom operatives guarded the perimeter, completely unaware of our sudden presence. I gave the silent visual signal, and the Ronin unit executed a perfectly coordinated, simultaneous strike. We neutralized the entire perimeter guard detail in exactly 3 seconds, expending 0 ammunition during the assault. I stepped over the fallen guards and walked directly toward the central command terminal. I expected to find Cage desperately attempting to delete his encrypted operational files, but the command chair was completely empty. Weaver rapidly connected her slate to the primary server, attempting to intercept any outgoing data transmissions. The artificial intelligence immediately flashed a massive red warning indicating a complete system lockdown. The central holographic projector suddenly activated, illuminating the dark room with a bright crimson light. A pre-recorded audio message began playing through the internal speakers, directed explicitly at my tactical unit. The voice was cold and completely devoid of any human emotion. It commended my primitive infiltration tactics, acknowledging that my strategic intellect far exceeded the capabilities of the modern Allied military command. The voice identified itself as Cage, confirming my previous hypothesis regarding his supreme operational awareness. He stated that the subterranean facility was not his primary command center, but a highly elaborate digital trap. The artificial intelligence indicated that a massive sequence of heavy explosive charges had just activated throughout the tunnels. The entire financial district above us was currently rigged to completely collapse inward. I possessed exactly 3 minutes to evacuate 50 operatives before the tunnels vaporized. I immediately ordered a rapid full retreat, abandoning the compromised Phantom servers to secure the survival of my human assets. We sprinted through the dark tunnels, completely ignoring the laser tripwires as the detonation sequence triggered. The heavy concrete ceiling began fracturing violently, dropping massive chunks of debris directly into our path. I calculated the optimal escape vector, utilizing a secondary ventilation shaft leading toward the river. We reached the narrow shaft and forcefully climbed upward as the primary explosions completely destroyed the subway station. We successfully breached the surface exactly 10 seconds before the entire financial district collapsed into a massive crater. The operation was a complete tactical failure, resulting in 0 captured intelligence and lost time. I analyzed the parameters of the digital trap, recognizing the undeniable brilliance of the enemy execution. Cage had intentionally sacrificed 50 elite operatives and millions in equipment purely to test my infiltration speed. Weaver recovered a single heavily encrypted data fragment from her brief connection to the Phantom server. She utilized the full processing power of the military artificial intelligence to finally break the unique encryption key. The decrypted file displayed a single highly degraded satellite photograph on her glowing slate. The image showed a man standing in the desert wearing a perfectly tailored modern combat uniform, completely devoid of any rank insignia. I examined the face in the photograph and felt a sudden sharp spike of absolute biological terror. The facial structure matched exactly with the ancient historical descriptions of my greatest rival from the 18th century. The artificial intelligence rapidly analyzed the genetic markers left at various Phantom crime scenes, cross-referencing the data. The machine confirmed a 99% probability of a direct genetic lineage to the historical figure. Cage was the direct modern descendant of Hattori Jiro, the legendary ninja general who had personally assassinated me 300 years ago. The entire global war against the Phantoms was merely a violent continuation of our ancient